Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Alia Ishaq, Managing Partner of Mashura Group, and we'll be moderating today's event. Just a quick overview of who we are. Mashura is a boutique consultancy focused on the Middle East and Africa. Our work covers the intersection between business and peace in the region. We're delighted to host today's event. We at Mashura have been following this alarming Safer issue for more than a year now as part of our risk analysis work, and we've decided to shed more light on this issue. I have to admit as well, this is a personal issue for me. It's close to my heart, being a Yemeni myself, and of course, following the developments on the ground with great concern. So we will start today with brief presentations from each of the speakers, followed by a discussion, and we will take questions in the end. If you have any questions throughout the presentations, please feel free to send your questions at the Q&A section, along with your name and the name of your organization, please. My colleagues and I will try our best, of course, to cover all your questions, time permitting. So if you have any questions that we haven't covered afterwards, please feel free to reach out to us. Today's lineup includes Dr. David Sood, a resource and security expert from IR Consilium, Doug Wire, an environment and conflict expert from the Conflict and Environment Observatory, CEOPS, Brittany Roser, an international politics expert from PAX. And last but certainly not least, we've got Murray Purvis, an incident modeling expert from Risk Aware. So we will start today's presentation with Dr. David Sood, a resource security expert. Dr. David Sood is head of research and analysis at IR Consilium, a boutique consultancy firm focused on maritime and resource security. Along with his colleagues, Dr. Sood has advocated for a resolution of the Safer threat for over 2 years and has written and contributed to numerous articles on the issue. So, Dr. David, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Alia, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and to join everyone in working out how to resolve this situation. It is eminently solvable, this problem, and so I very much appreciate being able to be here. The contributions of my fellow panelists and everyone who's joining us. What we're about to look at here in this first presentation is I'm going to very briefly run through some of the background for anyone who might be relatively new to the situation and just talk about some specific aspects of the vessel, the hazards to the vessel, and the risks that are entailed, leaving, of course, some of the details and specific subject areas to my fellow panelists. Now, of course, when you look at the map and you can see the location of the FSO Safer there, one of the first things that should be evident is its proximity to the shore, to the nearby headland, Kamaran Island there to the north of it, and the fact also that the Red Sea is, as it is technically termed, an enclosed marginal sea. You've got the Bab el-Mandeb down at the bottom there, of course, at the other end. You've got the Suez Canal. Whatever happens anywhere in the Red Sea ultimately happens just about everywhere in the Red Sea, because there are very few places for the water to go, though there are seasonal circulations and inflows and outflows that, one of my fellow panelists can go into later. Now, here are a couple of photos of the Safer itself. And just briefly to touch on its history, originally it was a seagoing supertanker, the Esso Japan, built in 1976. And it is worth noting, this is an old vessel. It is single-hulled. The industry standard now globally is double-hulled vessels for safety and structural integrity. It is very, very big, 370 meters long, 70 meters wide. It's got 34 storage tanks, and as has been widely disseminated, it is currently holding approximately 1.14 million barrels of Marib-light crude. It was originally retired from seagoing service and installed in 1988 as the FSO Safer. as the export point for the Marib-Ras Issa pipeline. The original plan was to actually, before the war, build a proper export terminal at Ras Issa. Obviously, the conflict made that impossible. And since pretty much the beginning of the conflict, the Safer has been under control of the Houthis in a conflict zone. And it has not been maintained according to any acceptable standard, any reasonable standard. And the degree of deterioration of the Safer is frightening. That's why we're all here. Just to run some numbers that can't be repeated enough, a spill of the cargo of the Safer would be 4 times the size of the Exxon Valdez spill of 1989. We've all heard recently in the news that in Mauritius, there was a recent breakup of a vessel with an oil spill that caused significant spoliation of the environment across a swath of nearly pristine marine environment. That spill, which achieved international headlines, involved 1/100th, less than 1% of the oil on board the Safer. And this vessel has been sitting for 5 years in the very, very harsh, highly saline, highly corrosive environment of the Red Sea, deteriorating to a point where, in our considered opinion, consulting with experts, it is really past the point of repair. And in order to understand some of that, you can see some images taken last year. These are of the exterior of the vessel. You can see the degree of corrosion, both on that single hull. You see spillage and broken equipment on the deck. Also on the interior, you see enormous amounts of corrosion that would be impacting the structural integrity of machinery, of pipelines, and of the hull itself. This is not a vessel that would be deemed safe in almost any location around the world. Now, just to give one example of the degree of deterioration and some of the risks that are entailed. First of all, the greatest risk, the one that most concerns us, is that the Safer will actually simply break up. That it will have reached such a degree of deterioration that it will fall apart, sink, and spill its contents into the Red Sea. And last year, on April 22nd, there was an incident, and this is an image from it, in which what had been an offloading hose pipe broke loose from its fixture on the vessel, and the end fell into the sea. You can see a little bit of a leakage from residue in the hose pipe there. That wasn't the problem. The problem was it started to take on water, it gained weight, it caught in the current, and the pull of that one piece of equipment, that one apparatus from the Safer, would have been enough, conceivably, to tug the vessel enough to create a rupture in the hull, to break up the vessel. A technical crew there of employees of CPOC, the Safer Exploration and Production Operations Company, the state-owned company that handles the Safer as much as they can, actually had to essentially amputate that part. They had to cut it loose from the Safer. And they had to do it in such a way so as to make sure that it did not sink and fall on the subsea pipeline coming to the Safer, and thereby rupture that, which would have caused actually a completely different spill in which the dense Red Sea water would have displaced the idle light crude oil in the pipeline. And however much, depending on the topography of that pipeline, could be displaced, could be almost as much as on the Safer, would actually be leaking gradually into the Red Sea. Now, this is the most recent incident from May 27th of this year, when a pipe in the cooling system ruptured and the seawater in the cooling system leaked into the engine room. This received a good deal of press. This was a potential catastrophe right there. Again, you can see the degree of corrosion. In the latest in a series of very skillful improvisations, the technical team were able to temporarily patch this, consult with a team of divers and direct them to seal some sea chests so that more permanent repairs could be, though not absolutely permanent repairs, could be done. And we're essentially looking at a vessel that is on life support, that is, to use a sort of medical metaphor, is terminally ill. It is not a question of whether the Safer will actually spill its contents. It's a question of when. Now, with all that in mind, I want to just briefly, while we take in this image, discuss just some specifics of the risks entailed by the situation as it stands now. First of all, we addressed this last year, is the risk of combustion. And while some people might say, well, that's kind of a marginal risk, actually it's quite real. It is crucial that crude oil, which off-gasses light fractions that can combust and cause catastrophic explosions, be stored in such a way that the headspace in a storage tank has less than 12% ambient oxygen. The US industry standard is actually 6%. If the tanks are not vapor tight, if, as in the case of the Safer, the inert gas system is not functioning, and I'll explain that in a moment, the oxygen level will climb up to atmospheric levels, and any errant spark or flame in the wrong place at the wrong time, especially if there's a fracture anywhere in these tanks and they are leaking vapor, could cause a massive explosion. An inert gas system, according to experts we've consulted with, should really be serviced about every 3 days. The Safer's inert gas system was last serviced 3 years ago. It's no longer functioning. We don't know to what extent there is venting, there are fractures, that some of these flammable vapors are escaping the tanks. But these things do happen. Just to take one famous example, in 1975, a barge carrying crude oil in Greenville, Mississippi in the United States blew up completely with loss of life because some workmen who were unaware that there was a vapor leak started doing some welding in the vicinity. Another example, a couple of years ago in Houston, a barge carrying gasoline exploded simply because a vapor from a leak was ignited by the simple action of dropping anchor. These hazards are very, very real, and we have been lucky so far that nothing of this sort has happened. Now, the oil in the Safer is exceptionally light. Marib-light crude has an API gravity of about 45, placing its viscosity somewhere along the lines of diesel fuel. We cannot be sure, this is one of the open questions about what we call onboard weathering. How much of the lightest fractions of that crude oil have already escaped and evaporated out of the storage tanks on the Safer? And that makes modeling a spill already a difficult undertaking, even more challenging, as I'm sure some of my fellow panelists can explain. But if we work under the assumption that only the lighter than air fractions have evaporated over the past 5 years, we're still looking at a 1 million+ barrel spill and what would be technically classified as persistent light oil. Now, that lightness would normally be a plus in that on open water, within a couple of days of spreading in the sun, as much as 75% of the oil spilled from the Safer would evaporate. Even in that best case scenario, the remainder would be the equivalent of the Exxon Valdez, a catastrophe by any measure. But that same lightness is a problem close to shore. And now recall the map that was in the first slide. When the spill reaches coastal turbulence less than 5 nautical miles away, it will become entrained, and that light oil will mix down the water column, creating a gigantic toxic shock to all the ecosystems encounters. And again, other panelists can detail the consequences of that. There are also humanitarian consequences. The Safer poses a potentially catastrophic threat to the region's most critical infrastructure, the desalination plants along the Red Sea coast. which supply millions of the region's people with clean water. Which ones were most affected by a spill would depend on the seasonal circulation, which will be explained later. But depending to some degree on the design of the intake and evaporation mechanisms in a given desalination plant, this could actually shut plants down completely for some time and on sufficient scale, plunge millions of people into hardship. In the case of the Yemeni people, already fragilized by years of conflict and famine, that would be beyond devastating. So there would be other economic consequences through the wider region as well, including to tourist industries, the costs of the cleanup operation, fisheries everywhere. And looking again at this last image, I would like to just sort of say here that we are really past the point of protracted processes of assessment and negotiation. Just this morning, news broke that the UN has agreed to Houthi demands that the oil remain on board the Safer and that any teams allowed to visit do so only to assess and arrange for repairs to the Safer itself. If that's in fact the case, well, in our opinion, that is simply not safe, it is not tenable, and it is not responsible. The only appropriate assessment is that of how to safely evacuate the Safer's cargo, followed swiftly by that actual operation. All other considerations, including allocations of any revenues, can be taken up after the oil is safe and secure. Accordingly, what we propose is a replacement, a seaworthy tanker, super tanker, or a couple of smaller tankers brought in, the oil transferred to those tankers. And that may be a difficult process, but it needs to be done. It depends on the conditions of the pumps that handle discharge from the Safer. And keep the oil on a seaworthy vessel or vessels in the same location, safe and secure, without hazard of a spill, while the other considerations are worked out. I would say, on behalf of IR Consilium, any entity that obstructs or slows that process is putting the lives and livelihoods of millions, as well as vital marine and coastal ecosystems, at terrible risk. Now, there are a number of other technical details involved I would be happy to discuss in Q&A, but I think it would be best to have us all give our presentations. And so I just thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. David. That was definitely a very interesting overview, and it's a grim picture. You spoke about, the threats of a leak, the threats of a combustion, and you touched a little bit about the solutions and what could be done to address this. So I would love to, get back to this more when we go into the discussion. But for now, let's move on. We've got next Doug Wire. Doug Wire is an environment and conflict expert. He is the head of CEOPS, which is the Conflict and Environment Observatory. CEOPS has been calling for international attention on the FSO Safer case since May 2018 and reporting on developmental and political issues around the case ever since. So, Doug, over to you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Alia. Just, thank you to Mishura for the invitation to speak on here, and just to say that I'm delighted that there's so much attention on this issue. And thank you to David for the introduction to the general context. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the timeline of how we got to where we are now to help give some context to the Q&A later, and then focus in on some of the environmental concerns around there. So just very briefly as to who we are, we're a UK charity, and we work to monitor environmental risks and environmental damage in conflicts. We also work to develop tools to increase data collection, and we also monitor and scrutinize policies intended to reduce harm. So just moving swiftly on. So here's a little timeline that I put together. As David had mentioned, things kind of start in 2015, and that was the point where the Houthis occupied the area of Ras Isa, the port area. And that meant that normal activities on the vessel came to a halt, and that was maintenance work. There was a withdrawal of tugboats and a helicopter. Ultimately, the Safer would run out of diesel fuel, which was using to power its generators, failed the pumps to pump in the inert gas that David raised. And back at that time, states like the UK did flag the Safer as a potential threat. Moving on, there wasn't a huge amount of attention in the sort of following couple of years, and it wasn't until early 2018 that the government of Yemen wrote to the Secretary General of the UN to request technical assistance to deal with the problem. And it was that which we picked up on early in 2018 and published an initial assessment of the situation in the hope of bringing more attention to the issue. And yeah, I think at the time, we likened it to the risk or compared it to the risk of the Exxon Valdez, which I'll come back to later because it's kind of an interesting comparison, but one which has become very much part of the narrative around this vessel. In August that year, the UN's UNOPS, they published a contract for an initial technical assessment. It was a short contract period in the middle of August, and it was awarded to a company called Asia Offshore, who were going to go in and do an initial assessment that we're still waiting for. And then by December, things had been relatively quiet, but it was clear that in the context of the negotiations around the Stockholm Agreement around access to Hodeida and that coastal strip, that the Safer had come up, but it's not entirely clear how that had figured in the actual negotiations themselves. There was patches of interest up until the start of 2019, and then we were very pleased to see David and IR Consilium publish the first of a series of publications on the issue, and that really helped to amplify global attention on it. OCHA in the UN Security Council, they started raising the issue of the Safer and have done so every month ever since. And yeah, had this business of the pipeline becoming detached from the vessel. This really helped sort of build up political attention, and there was a real flurry of activity between April and kind of June. There was some media attention, but also quite a lot of going backwards and forwards between the Houthis and government of Yemen, both of whom were speaking to the UN's resident coordinator in Yemen. And in fact, the Houthis at this stage were also asking for technical assistance to deal with the vessel. By June, things were looking very positive. There was an agreement that the UN would have access for a technical inspection. Even more global media attention. Outlets like The Guardian picked it up, and yeah, there was a huge amount of interest. But by July, the Houthis had turned down access to the vessel for the UN. In August, Risk Aware had been requested by the UK Department for International Development to do some modelling, which Murray will talk about shortly, and they provided an initial risk assessment to DFID. And then, yeah, there were behind the scenes discussions between states and parties to the conflict and regional states throughout that time up until earlier this year, when the UN Security Council published Resolution 2511, which was a general resolution on Yemen, but for the first time included language on the fate of the Safer. And in February, Risk Aware provided quite detailed modelling to DFID on fire and spill, impact of a fire and a major spill. In March, and following up to the Security Council interests, the littoral states of the Red Sea wrote to the Secretary General to express deep concern about the issue. By May, still a fairly high level of political interest, and we had these exchanges between Mohammed al-Houthi and the UK ambassador to Yemen, and also to the US State Department, in which we saw Houthis downplaying environmental risks, saying, well, look at the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, why are you so concerned about the environment? And then by July, shortly before the UN Security Council held its first ever dedicated session on the fate of the Safer, the Houthis had agreed again for the UN to have access, and the Security Council, obviously, as you've probably all seen, developed a huge amount of global media attention. And now, of course, it's August. Still, as far as we can see, no great progress on the technical inspection. There seems to be some discussion over this deal about keeping the oil on the vessel, which to us, it feels a little bit like kicking a rusty can further down the road and doesn't seem to be a particularly satisfactory conclusion. So that's kind of where we are and how we've got to where we are. I'll just talk a little bit about the environmental issues which we're sort of chiefly concerned about. Obviously, there is a potential risk of a very large oil spill, ultimately. And as David's already mentioned, the kind of oil we're dealing with is quite very light fraction. It may be a somewhat heavier, depending on how it's weathered within the vessel. But you know, the issues you see from oil spills are clearly a toxic effect on marine life, which will have a huge significant impact on the entire food chain, the entire ecosystem around the Red Sea area. And it's not just from the oil, but also from the dispersant chemicals, which are typically used to break up the oil in these situations. One of the things which is flagged up as particularly problematic is the coral diversity in the Red Sea, which, because of the way the physical characteristics of the Red Sea, high temperatures, high salinity, you have a whole family of corals which genetically they're very important as we look towards climate change. Obviously, you may have come across coral bleaching incidents where you have high temperatures which kills off coral. These corals in the Red Sea are resistant to those temperatures. So genetically, they could be very important, will likely be very important for repopulating coral reefs harmed by climate change. One thing that's also very problematic is also damage to coastal mangroves. And these are critical environments, critical parts of the ecosystem. They act as nurseries and shelter for young fish. They're also fodder and fuel for people. And they also provide protection from climate change impacts as well. And one of the issues with them is that it can take decades to recover from oil spills. And oil has a particular tendency to gather in mangroves because of the mud which they sort of attract. And here on the right is Cameron Island. This is a marine protected area, at least on paper. Further development of this area has been hampered by the conflict, but as you can see, there are some of the most pristine stands of mangroves along this area of the Red Sea coast. And in terms of damage to biodiversity, it's not just, you're familiar with oiled seabirds from oil spills and things like that, but what you're actually doing is causing permanent disruption to these ecosystems. By knocking out key species, the ecosystem doesn't come back as it was. Species change, physical conditions change. And so actually you're looking at this permanent alteration of biodiversity within the Red Sea area if there is a very large spill. And then just briefly, just look at some of these other, these environmental emergencies aren't unique to this conflict. They're pretty common. In Colombia, for years, you had hundreds of pipeline attacks from the ELN. The Iran-Iraq war, you had significant spills from attacks on tankers and oil platforms. 1991 Gulf War, famously, you had a huge oil spill. Also in Serbia, you had NATO's bombing of the Pančevo petrochemical plant. In Ukraine, up till the present day, we still have real serious concerns about damage to chemical plants and chemical industry in the area. And obviously in 2016 in Iraq, you had these deliberate attacks and fires from Iraqi wells and pipelines. But what would be unusual about the Safer is that this is an unusual, utterly predictable, utterly preventable case of deliberate neglect. It's not somebody directly shooting at it. This is a political decision to allow this vessel to essentially reach a stage where it causes an environmental catastrophe. And then just in comparison, we talked about the Exxon Valdez that everybody kind of knows, but I think what's significant about the Exxon Valdez is that it wasn't necessarily the size of the spill, which, as you can see in comparison to some of these other ones, it was relatively small, at least in comparison to the Gulf War. But what it did do was have a very significant impact on legal and political issues around oil spills, not just in the US, but more broadly around the globe. And the Safer, I think, if we have a spill of this level, will have a sort of similarly massive political and legal impact. And blame is very clearly going to sit with the Houthi administration. I think I shall leave it there. So yeah, thank you very much. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thank you for giving us an overview of the environmental impact, which is very, very huge, very clearly. I'd be curious as well during the discussion to learn more in terms of the legal impact and what does this actually mean if a spill is to occur. Who would be responsible and what legal implications are we talking about? But we can discuss that more during the Q&A. Next, we've got Murray Purvis. He's an incident modeling expert with RiskAware. RiskAware is an incident modeling solutions provider offering actionable insights on environmental, human, and security challenges worldwide. Murray Purvis has researched and modeled the risk of a potential Safer spill, as we've discussed earlier, the findings of which have been disseminated widely within the UK and internationally. And Murray will explain to us now some of their findings. Murray?
Hi, thanks for the introduction. So I don't need to say what RiskAware are and what we do now, because you think you've very nicely introduced us there. I want to also extend, my thanks and the thanks of Risk Aware for inviting us to be part of this. It is a piece of work that I think as it's gone on, we've become very invested in ourselves. And we're very keen, I think, along with everyone here, that hopefully what we're doing is going to bring about, bring us further closer towards a positive solution to this, however unlikely that may seem at times. So what I'm going to talk about today is a kind of a whistle-stop tour of this modelling that we've done, and some of the results of which you may have seen. There'll be some new stuff in here too, and how we kind of we look towards quantifying some of these unknowns. We know a lot about the SAFA, but there's also a lot that we don't know, and then how we bring those kind of things into modelling this, and it also applies to many other kind of disaster modelling or release modelling of hazardous materials as well. So if I can make this work, there we go. So Risk Aware's involvement in this is I think has been talked about. We've been providing some modelling support to the UK's Department for International Development. And that's been through our kind of partners that we work with, is another agency in the UK called the Satellite Applications Catapult. And the work that we've done, it's not just been us. So we've been doing, driving the modelling and the simulation parts of this. But there's also been ACAPS, who are a humanitarian analysis kind of agency that they've been looking at the impacts analysis. So when we talk about what these oil spills mean, that's generally been their input there. And also the Catapult have been providing us with the kind of project coordination and the geospatial support that we did. As we've talked about, we've looked at two modelling themes primarily. And so we've looked at the oil slick modelling, so what would happen if the SAFA were to release its oil into the water, and also atmospheric transport and dispersion modelling, in which we've looked at the potential pollution implications of a major fire on board the vessel. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point, we have, and I'll talk about this a bit later, we've looked at kind of worst case modelling so far. Looking at what's the reasonable worst thing that we think may happen, and so as a result of that, we've actually considered those oil slick and the atmospheric transport modelling separately, and we've considered the risks from them separately. So, kind of in short, our job really is to give an idea of what a release of oil from the SAFA might look like, whether that be to the water or to the atmosphere, and what places are most likely to be impacted. And so, we have to, starting out modelling these kind of things, you kind of separate out what you know and what you don't. And so, as we've talked about, we know exactly it's a fixed terminal, we know where the SAFA is, and we also know what's on board, both in terms of the type of oil and how much. We also know that it's very likely, there is a huge risk of a release from this vessel, but we don't know exactly what that release might look like in terms of how much oil might be released or how quickly. And we also don't know when it might happen. We know that there's a risk that it will happen or it may happen, but we don't know what time of year that might happen. And as Dr. Sild said, that has implications that the Red Sea is very seasonal. And so we have to account for these kind of unknowns in our modelling. And so we did that in two ways. With our source time, we did something that we do quite often when you're looking at kind of these kind of incident modelling and that kind of thing. You choose what you think is a reasonable worst case. And so in this case, whether it be for the fire or the oil spill, it was a release of the entirety of the inventory of the SAFA, everything on the vessel in a short space of time, so to maximise the acute effects of this. And so that's kind of what we've done. We've talked about that a little bit here. And then the meteorology and the oceanography really have the biggest impact to our modelling, and really is what defines this process. You can't define really, it's very difficult to define at least, worst case weather conditions. And also, as we've talked about, the region is very, very seasonal. And so this led us to take a statistical approach to our modelling, where we've taken a range of realistic weather conditions, and we've used historic weather databases for that, and run tons and tons, hundreds, thousands of simulations taken across that range of weather that we've got access to. And this means that it can kind of give us a good representation of the typical weather and the water conditions for the timeframes that we're considering here. It may not be representative of some of the extreme weather conditions that might occur, because they're very unlikely. They may not have been in the databases that we've looked at. But in general, it's going to be very representative of the weather conditions in the region. We've also separated the analysis into different periods. And again, that's that seasonality stuff. And we'll see the impact of that later on in these slides. It also meant this was very computationally expensive. We needed a big computer and to leave it on for a long time, basically. And when we run this statistical output, our statistical approach led to a statistical output, really. And so it means that the results that we've seen and that we've shared require a little bit more thought than perhaps a typical model of this nature. Because this isn't, if here what we're looking at are images of the predicted risk of contamination from July to September, so the period that we're kind of in the middle of right now. But it's not showing exactly, if an incident were to happen in this time, this is exactly where the oil would go. Because we don't know, there's different weather conditions depending on, maybe the time of day or whether it's in July or September. There is a range of conditions in here. And so what we have here, these plots are called probability of exceedance plots. And so actually what it means is that here we're looking at, between naught and, if we focus on the oil spill one on the left, the atmospheric dispersion model on the right is exactly the same in what it represents. What we're looking at is between the time of a release, the start of a release, and the time on the chart, what's the estimated probability that those areas shown on that map receive a level of contamination above some threshold. So it's not how much oil it's going to receive, it's what's the probability of it receiving oil, what's the probability of it experiencing a certain level of contamination. And so here we're looking at, I believe, an oil surface thickness of about 5 microns, which is kind of a reasonable level of contamination. On the right with the atmospheric concentration, it's actually, specifically it's 71 micrograms per cubic meter, but essentially that lines up with the UK's DEFRA kind of highest pollution levels, so very, very polluted, very high pollution. And so what that means is that essentially, should the worst happen and there was to be a release from the Safer, the results aren't going to look exactly like this. What it's going to look like, it's going to be, very likely to be somewhere within this, with the probability of where it's going to go being related to the colours on the chart, basically. So, the more red is, the higher the probability that that location would receive contamination from a release. And so we have the static maps here. And what we can also do with this is look at animations here. And so here we're showing the kind of evolution of this risk. And so now we're looking at, as we go to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days, you can see the areas, the predicted, likely spread of this release going on. And so that's kind of one of the things that you may have seen here is these animations showing that evolution of risk. So it's not directly the transport and dispersion of oil or the transport and dispersion of pollution, but it's kind of that evolution of a risk. And so as we've talked about, what makes this even more complicated is just how seasonal these releases are. And so you can see here we have in the top left January to March, top right is April to June, the bottom left is the July to September one that we've been talking about most recently, and the bottom right being October to December. And you can see the evolution of this risk looks very, very different depending on the time of year. And so you can see that, towards the winter months from January to March, and then the October to December ones as well, the risk is primarily to the north of the vessel and to those islands that we've talked about. With, towards the spring, summer, you have that kind of, it turns around and you get the most likely direction of travel of this oil going down towards the south. And ACAPS have kind of told us through their analysis of what this means is that actually what we are right now kind of living in the riskiest part of the year when it comes to impact of this spill for the Yemeni people and their ecosystems. And so you can see there the highest risk and the highest impact to Yemen occurs within those months of July to September. But actually there's the very high probability that the port of Al Hodeida there will be shut down no matter when in the year such a release may occur. And so that was what I had. That was kind of a whistle-stop tour there of the modelling that we did. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about this more and take any questions later on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Murray, for this overview. I mean, it's really fascinating and scary, obviously, at the same time. You know, to see the different levels of risks there, and to just think that we are actually at the worst time now if a spill is to occur. So yeah, I'm curious to discuss that more during the Q&A, and just see, you know, if a spill is to occur, how likely is it, for example, to reach other areas as well in the region, and how much impact would that be? But now we go into discussing the politics of this a little bit. So we go to Brittany. Brittany Roser is an international politics expert. She is the UN Advocacy Advisor for PAX in New York, where she focuses on identifying opportunities and fostering strategic engagements and partnerships on a variety of peace and security issues with key international actors, including the UN and its member states. In recent years, Brittany has worked with the UN Security Council and other international stakeholders in consultation on the environment, peace, and security agenda, which includes in regards to the FCO Safer situation. So, Brittany, over to you.
Thanks very much, Alia. Also, sorry, let me just make sure everything's moving forward with my presentation. Thanks also to the Mashura group for convening this meeting, and also, of course, for the other interventions by the other panelists, very informational, and also has made my job slightly easier as the final panelist. As you may know, PAX is an international peace organization working in 15 conflict-affected countries with a focus on improving human security and also on protecting civilians through working in strategic partnerships at all levels. As you discussed a little bit also in the international policy arenas, as I do, but also with my colleagues working with local peace builders and communities dealing with direct causes and impacts of conflict on the ground. Throughout PAX's peace work, we have repeatedly seen the detrimental impacts of armed conflict on the environment and the resulting perilous consequences for civilians and sustainable peace and development efforts. For the last 10 years, my colleagues have been working and monitoring developments in conflict situations such as in Iraq, in Syria, Yemen, of course, and Ukraine, where the serious and long-term risks of environmental damage for civilian populations have become of increasing concern, as the environment has either deliberately targeted or has suffered damage as a byproduct of conflict. For example, oil wells and sulfur stockpiles in Iraq were set on fire by ISIS in 2016, resulting in mass casualty events with an ongoing pollution legacy, while so-called rivers of death, rivers of crude oil and oil waste run through northeastern Syria, flowing from improperly maintained oil facilities, polluting soil and groundwater, with disastrous effects on the livelihoods of farmers, on food security in the region, and the potential health of civilians dependent on these waterways for survival. Similar concerns surround the potential looming humanitarian, environmental, and economic catastrophe of the deteriorating Safer tanker, but on a potentially exponentially larger scale, as my colleagues have already touched on today. However, before addressing the issue around the FSO Safer, it's important to note that the situation can really not be seen in a vacuum, and rather it should be seen through the lens of the ongoing conflict in Yemen and the actions and decisions of all parties to the conflict. Since the start of the current armed conflict in 2015, a relentless bombing campaign conducted by the Saudi and UAE-led coalition has led to arguably the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today, while the Houthis have also carried out direct attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, further compounding the humanitarian impacts of the conflict to date. The latest numbers currently show that over 15 million people are on the brink of starvation in Yemen, with nearly 9,000 civilians killed, nearly 10,000 more wounded, and millions displaced, of course. Meanwhile, money is being sent to further fuel the conflict, with billions of dollars having been spent on high-tech weapons. In Houthi-controlled areas, funding is also diverted from intended recipients to the armed forces. In seeking a solution to the Safer situation, we urge that we have to do so in the context of the conflict in Yemen, where all parties have their share of responsibility that led to the situation as it stands. We cannot separate this situation and its potentially disastrous impacts from the existing grave humanitarian suffering in the country, and that notably is the conflict itself. And has brought us to the situation at hand with the Safer. Moving to the specifics around the Safer situation, thanks to Doug and my other colleagues for very thoroughly going through timeline and ramifications. So I can skip the background a bit and go straight to the most recent developments in the July 2020 Security Council meeting, where UN Under Secretary General and Executive Director to the UN Environment Program, Inger Andersen, told Security Council members sort of the specifics around the modeling, the worst case scenarios that RiskAware has predicted, and essentially showing the detrimental impacts of an oil spill, not just on the lives and livelihoods in Yemen, but also reaching the entire Red Sea region, impacting regional stability and international security. This is exactly why it's been placed on the Security Council's agenda repeatedly, and why the Security Council has been raising this as a high-risk hazard continuously on the discussions on the Yemeni conflict. However, despite repeated calls by the Security Council for the Houthis to grant access for inspection and safe extraction of the crude oil stored on the Safer tanker, unfortunately, over-politicization of this looming catastrophe has thus far paralyzed attempts at remediation and prevention. Furthermore, cleanup for a Safer oil spill would be especially challenging, as has also been noted today, as one can see from the difficulty surrounding cleanup for the recent oil spill from the Japanese tanker off the coast of Mauritius, mentioned by our colleagues already, so I won't go into details, but I think the main point to raise here is that there are still difficulties in organizing proper cleanup still even a month later. And meanwhile, comparatively, the Safer tanker is located near one of the world's busiest shipping corridors along the coast of a country in the midst of a civil war, which is not the case for the Mauritius spill, and yet there's still difficulty. So furthermore, any cleanup operation for the Safer would necessitate the involvement of regional actors, bringing in further complicated regional political dynamics, which have contributed already to the gridlock and inaccessibility of the tanker by independent international experts thus far. And furthermore, if this were to happen sooner, it could also be compounded by COVID-19 restrictions and related delays. Yes, so in order to provide a meaningful and sustainable solution, the international community must take a structural approach to this and other conflict-related environmental threats to civilian lives and livelihoods, as well as to regional and international security and stability. Though there are existing legal frameworks that, to a limited effect, protect the environment under international environmental law, and as a civilian object under international humanitarian law, there are currently no existing international mechanisms that address the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts in a robust way throughout the entire conflict life cycle, be it before, during, or after a conflict. This hinders rapid response capacities to acute environmental threats and long-term impacts of environmental damage. In a case like that of the Safer tanker, this leaves the international community at risk of paralysis through gridlock, seeking ad hoc, restricted solutions that limit prevention and mitigation capacities. This lack of a systematic international policy framework to address these issues, paired with the increasing attention drawn to the concerning situations in Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, and other situations where conflict-related environmental damage or exploitation have posed risks to peace and security, has led to the emergence of environment, peace, and security as a priority theme on the agenda of many international actors and organizations in the last decade. Discussions around the breadth and scope of environmental damage and possible solutions have already been held in Security Council ARIA formula meetings on conflict and environment in 2018 and 2019, where PAX and UNEP presented recent examples from armed conflicts and, of course, ideas and proposals on how to move forward. At these meetings, Council members recognized the intrinsic link between environment, peace, and security and the harmful environmental impacts of conflicts on civilian populations in particular, noting the need for a coherent, coordinated UN approach. This is including through improved monitoring and regular reporting, mainstreaming protection of the environment across the UN system, including in mandates of peace operations, and strengthening existing legal frameworks. Of course, we welcome more attention on the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts on the Security Council's agenda, particularly the effects of the environmental impacts of conflict on civilians. And the UN Secretary General has also further raised the direct environmental impacts of conflict on human health and suffering in both his 2019 and 2020 reports to the Security Council on the protection of civilians, and earlier this month directly raised his concern around the Safer tanker situation and the risks it poses, calling, of course, for unconditional access to the tanker for immediate assessment and potential urgent repairs. Environment, peace, and security has been at the center of many multilateral debates, driving the international processes in recent years that warrant further support and engagement from governments and the international community. For example, the publishing of the International Law Commission, their 28 draft principles on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, also known as PARAC, in 2019, and 2 UN Environmental Assembly resolutions in 2016 and 2017 on protection of the environment in armed conflict and conflict pollution, respectively, that helped to bridge the gap in the security and environment discourse in the UN, helping to lead to some of the conversations that we're having today. However, the international community has to move beyond incidental issues that are dealing sort of on an ad hoc basis and move to more of a structural approach, establishing infrastructure that contributes to timely identification and monitoring of environmental issues in armed conflicts, how this relates to the protection of civilians and their livelihoods, and of course, best practices to be put in place for prevention, mitigation, remediation of environmental damage, particularly on such a scale as the Safer situation. In the meantime, what can the international community do? Considering the serious cross-boundary pollution risks and severe damage to the natural environment that my colleagues already noted, and of course, civilian lives and livelihoods, as I've been discussing throughout, a solution must be found to prevent a regional environmental disaster with wide-reaching detrimental impacts. As noted, parties to the conflict have a direct responsibility to take all measures possible to prevent this crisis. Much of what has been an issue thus far has been a lack of motivation for working together to actually achieve this. However, other stakeholders, particularly regional governments such as Djibouti, Egypt, Eritrea, Jordan, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, and other, of course, non-affiliated international actors should work together with the UN to identify opportunities for engagement with the Houthis in an effort to motivate their cooperation in granting unconditional access to the Safer tanker for assessment and necessary repairs, as well as, and I can't stress this enough, the offloading of the oil. And I think, of course, with today's news, we'd be very much opposed to any agreement that wouldn't include this. In the possibility of non-cooperation, the Security Council has floated the idea of additional targeted sanctions and should continue to meet on the Safer issue regularly, and all environment, peace, and security issues should be raised regularly on the Security Council's agenda to explore options to address Safer, but also other conflict-related environmental threats to peace and security in a structural way, as I've noted. The international community must recognize the intrinsic links between environment, peace, and security. Cases such as the Safer FSO, but also other relevant issues around deliberate destruction and damage to or control over natural resources such as water infrastructure, agriculture, and forests can also have long-term security implications and threaten regional stability. And they need to be directly addressed and or incorporated in post-conflict reconstruction efforts. As obviously we've just explored today, the long-lasting implications. And this absolutely has to be taken as part of an incorporated approach for more sustainable environmental peace building. We welcome the pledge made by the Nordic countries at the 2019 International Conference of the International Committee of the Red Cross on the protection of the natural environment in armed conflict, and hope that the Safer situation can also be a useful case to seek an implementable solution with expertise and or funding to assist in mitigating international environmental disaster amidst the conflict in Yemen. The case of the FSO Safer also underlines the urgency to find wider solutions through the UN Security Council and other relevant multilateral fora. One key tool that the international community can begin implementing now to improve prevention of similar conflict-related environmental crisis situations would be for the UN Secretariat to provide regular briefings to the Security Council on the security implications of conflict-related environmental damage in relevant country situations and thematic debates on the Council's agenda, addressing wider environmental concerns around legacy pollution from past wars and armed conflicts and current conflicts, as well as post-conflict response. This would be in order to foster a better understanding of challenges faced by states recovering from armed conflicts, helps give a voice to affected communities through consultations with civil society, can foster dialogue on conduct of military operations, and helps to inform peace-building processes. It should also be linked, of course, to state-led initiatives with the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as ongoing work related to issues around natural resources and other relevant environmental issues throughout the UN's peace and security architecture. All of this can be supported through regular national and or regional assessments conducted by the Secretary General where relevant on specific conflict-related environmental risks that include analysis of both the wider impact of past and current conflict on civilian harm, natural resources, biodiversity, water and food security, environmental governance capacities, etc. And considering that each region, as we can see with the Safer situation, has unique environmental conditions and issues related to relevant armed conflicts, a national and or regional assessment could identify and deepen understanding of threats and opportunities to prevent or mitigate these dimensions and allow for early warning and early action for prevention, as we are trying to do at the moment with this webinar in the aims of preventing a Safer disaster. Lastly, of course, we welcome further engagement with all states, experts, and civil society, and really all relevant stakeholders to explore opportunities to develop such a multilateral policy framework and work towards the mainstreaming of environment and conflict response in order to protect civilians and the environment. Thanks very much for your attention. Also, if you would like to contact me with any questions, there's of course the Q&A session, which I'm looking forward to, but my contact details here. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brittany. Unfortunately, we only have a few more minutes left. So what I'll do is, because we've got a lot of questions, so I'll just direct a few questions to each one of you. And if you could please answer in 2 minutes, that would be great. So David, there was a particular interest in the proposal or the solution that you proposed. We've got questions about, is it possible for this to be implemented? Have you proposed this to the UN? What is the reaction to that? So if you could please comment on that. Doug, if you could please as well comment on the initial suggestion as well, and if you can elaborate a little bit on what would be the cost to the infrastructure of oil and gas in Yemen if the FSO tanker is to be emptied, if that's something that would have an effect at all. To Murray, if you could please elaborate on whether the spill could reach all the way to the Suez Canal. And we've got here a question asking whether it could affect Bab el-Mandab in Yemen and what would be the implications of that. And Brittany, I've got a question for you with regards to the role of China, if China can play any role in terms of mediating something out of this. Please, David, if you could please go first.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the question. We actually have floated that proposal directly via Twitter to Mohammed Ali al-Houthi. And that very publicly, of course. So we have put it out there as a general proposal. It seems to us a very reasonable one, given that the Houthis want to keep the oil on site. And our priority is preventing a humanitarian and environmental catastrophe that would arise from a spill, the breaking up or whatever of the Safer. So in terms of hearing back, so far, there have been some people, some sources have indicated that they believe that's a good idea. Some commentators who have indicated something similar, but to my knowledge, it's not at this point become part of the ongoing dialogue. I could be mistaken on that. Obviously, these things are done very discreetly, but we have certainly floated that proposal.
Doug?
Yeah, I think, the time we've been following this, you sit there and you try and think what the solution could be to these situations. And I think what's very clear is that we need creative solutions, and yet the highly politicized context of the conflict actually limit the kind of creativity and options that are open. I think, alluding to some of the things that Brittany said about this issue of should this be tied into the trajectory of a conflict as part of a wider peace agreement, in the way that the Houthi has been trying to juggle in different kinds of deals into this agreement to allow a UN inspection, is a difficult one. I think the question of this issue has become deeply politicized, which it has, and with every sort of new layer of media coverage, it becomes more politicized, but that seems impossible to avoid in this context. And the media attention is critically important for bringing states to actually focus in on this issue and try and seek solutions. It's incredibly complex, and I think we should be open to exploring all solutions. I think the possibility of offloading onto safe and reliable tankers is seemingly one of the best ones. I think it's clear that the Safer itself isn't secure. I don't see any way that you could do some minor repairs to it and expect it to still be safe in a year's time, 2 years' time, however long the conflict will take and whatever trajectory it may take beyond present day. More broadly, I think, there are key issues around the role of the FSO Safer. As David talked about at the beginning, this was an export terminal and a critically important part of Yemen's economic architecture. This was where the oil from the Marib oil field, which came through the Marib Ras Issa pipeline, was offloaded and sold to the world. So in terms of the future sort of economic interests of the Houthis, potentially, if they lose the vessel itself, then that's a fairly large chunk of their oil export potential. And that's something which, again, needs to be addressed in these discussions and needs creativity and an open mind. Yeah, I'll leave it there, I think.
Thank you very much for commenting on that. And I do agree with you. There's a need for finding creative solutions that actually tackle the problem and look at it in a realistic way. Murray?
Yeah, so the first question regarding the possibility of a spill reaching all the way to the Suez Canal. I think if we kind of recall the seasonal outputs that I showed, those videos, unfortunately, what we've considered to date is really the first week after the start of a spill. So as beyond that, we haven't explicitly modeled it, but the oil, would or will continue on. And especially in those winter months where we saw the risk to regions to the north of the Safer was greatest, it would probably take, maybe a few weeks for the oil to travel all that way, beyond the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and up towards the Gulf. But it would certainly be possible. And I think, you couldn't rule that out, especially if nothing were done to try and stop it getting there. With the deployment of mitigation measures like booms and stuff, you certainly could, and I would hope they would try to stop it before it got that far. And then the second part of the question was about if it would head out, towards to the south, out into the Gulf of Aden. And again, if we look at especially the July to September predictions that we saw, and that the ones that have been most widely shared to date, we do see that even within a week, the oil does have, quite a high probability of heading that way and getting that far. And so I think that would have, a huge impact on shipping in the region and shipping through that strait there. And again, possibly, it's beyond that kind of first week after a release that we modeled. But as it heads out into the Gulf, it certainly has the possibility of impacting, countries like Somalia.
Thank you so much, Murray. Brittany?
Yeah. Thanks so much for this question. A role for China, of course. China has already played a strong role in this as a member of the Security Council, and they are playing a strong role, particularly as a P5 member in closed-door negotiations, especially around sanctions and the like. But because of this, I would say that they not only have an opportunity, but really a responsibility to engage. And as they're playing sort of an international mediating role. But I think the issue here is that it cannot just be one state that is playing a mediating role. It has to be a multilateral process, an international project involving all relevant stakeholders, so that all of the sort of political cleavages are addressed and incorporated into a solution so that it's sustainable. And I also think that one of the main points of my presentation was that we need to systematize efforts to sort of address these issues and look for remediation of these types of situations. So it can't be an ad hoc process that is just bringing in, one large state to sort of deal with it, as I said, not necessarily sustainable. And we need to establish the actual tools within the international system to be able to deal with these issues before they reach a disaster level, so that we're not facing this situation again, either in Yemen down the road with the Safer situation, or internationally and in other conflict situations. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you to all the panelists. You've been great today. Thank you for giving us your insights into this. It's a very informative discussion on a very urgent and alarming issue. I wish we had more time today to cover all the questions. We've got many questions from the audience, but unfortunately, we'd have to end it here. But please feel free to send us your questions after this discussion. We'd be happy to look into that. Yes, and here we come to the end of this session today. Thank you all again. Thank you to the participants, and have a good day.